Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler. Most watches will never see the slightest ounce of action in their lifetime. They'll be designed, sold and disappear into history just as surviving examples appear in second-hand windows. Some, it must be said, will have the opportunity to enjoy one major encounter after which they'll forever be known. Take for example the Omega Speedmaster and the moon landings, a half-century love affair of great achievement and great advertising. Even so, almost none get to enjoy two discrete moments of action. Hanhart's 417, a model revived after many years of dormancy as the brand's cheapest, simplest and yet perhaps most desirable chronograph, is one of those very examples. The second life lived by this particular reference, and perhaps the most famous it must be said, was its use by Steve McQueen to time racing as well as to be used as a simple, everyday chronograph after also being a staple of the German Air Force in the 1950s. But to really understand this fantastically elegant modern chronograph, you have to understand the history of the German brand behind it. Whilst you could see Hanhart stopwatches throughout motorsport culture from the 1950s onward, particularly in rallying, it's a series of pilot's watch released in the 1930s, 40s and 50s for which the brand is best remembered. Let me take you back to 1938 when Hanhart launched their first Aviation chronograph and the Caliber 40, a manual, monopusher chronograph movement which formed the basis for Hanhart's chronograph success. A year later, Hanhart produced the Caliber 41, a follow-up with a more modern dual-pusher configuration, as well as the option of a tachy-telly dial. Even so, the overall design of this Aviation chronograph was not only retained, but also pretty groundbreaking. I'd go so far as to say that it influenced the very course of the Aviation chronograph, despite being a tad crude in its first iterations. Importantly, a simple, dual sub-dial arrangement was paired with a rotating bezel to give good legibility in spite of a complex feature set. Nevertheless, these watches did have some unusual quirks, like asymmetrical pusher placement and quintessentially 30s cathedral hands which, after the war, were dropped in favour of pencil shapes. Interestingly, these watches weren't actually produced in any great quantity during the most part of the Second World War, with Hanhart instead supplying military equipment such as torpedo timers. Despite being popular with pilots, these weren't after all actually commissioned by the government. And whilst it can't be verified, it's thought that the famous red reset pusher used by this brand arrived during this time when a pilot's girlfriend painted the watch with her red nail varnish. After resuming production in 1948 after a 3-year gap, Hanhart produced watches for the French forces and also saw its movement used in the Type 20 aviation chronographs required for the French Air Force in the 1950s. And incidentally, it was the Hanhart chronographs of the 30s and 40s which formed the blueprint for Breguet's later Triumph and the brief which the French Air Force put forward for the creation of their own French chronographs. Back in the Black Forest, however, Hanhart was producing a second generation of their iconic watch. This had a smaller, refined crown, a sharper, more resolved case, symmetrical pushers, a dial with a cleaner, simpler aesthetic, and new hands. But where does the new 417 ES come in? Well, the 417 was the culmination of the Hanhart chronograph before they moved entirely to stopwatches in the early 1960s. In this context, it really seems about time that Hanhart offers an answer to this particular timepiece. Nevertheless, one can't deny that such a revival put a lot of pressure on Hanhart to get it right, and when one considers that a handful of different case shapes, dial arrangements and even case materials were available in period, it was imperative for this brand to choose wisely, and choose wisely they have. The suffix ES stands for Edelstahl, stainless steel, since it was available in plated brass as well in period. A more important choice, though, is the specific design which came from a particular variant visible on the brand's Instagram page. The result is a far more complex arrangement than the basic, brushed lugs of the particular model chosen by Steve McQueen, with sharply beveled lugs along their sides and rather unusually their tips. This appearance is extremely faithfully replicated by the new 417 ES, with a crispness of bevel and fineness of brushing rather uncharacteristic for this sub-£2,000 price bracket. In many ways, it's details like these which come to define the wearing experience of the new 417 ES as delightfully simple, but never lacking in visual intrigue. Take for instance the transition from case side to case back, which isn't complicated but has a very pleasant break between brushed and polished surfaces and is cut to emphasise the downward direction of the lugs. Speaking of the lugs, the proportions are particularly important to understand if you're a potential buyer of this watch. You see, originally this was a 39mm watch with subdials pushed to the very edges of the dial, whilst in modern form the format has grown to 42mm. This isn't, however, the whole story. The new model features a larger dial, which off the wrist one might mistake for that of a 44mm watch, whilst on the wrist the shortened lugs give a demeanour closer to that of a 40mm piece. It's an uncanny design and one which I reckon gives the best balance of historical fidelity with a genuine improvement to the product, particularly because it moved the subdials from their original, rather unbecoming position to a more balanced one within the Arabic numerals. Even so, for the purist, I have been permitted to say that a smaller size will be appearing in the collection at some point, but I'm afraid I can't tell you what the size will be or when it'll come out. Given the current market inclinations, I wouldn't be too surprised if it was the smaller watch which became more popular, but allow me to caution you. On my 7-inch wrist, the 42mm size is pretty much perfect in terms of stability and curvature. In any case, I'm grateful that Hanhart haven't taken Pilot's watch as an excuse to remove water resistance, as this model holds a very respectable 100-metre rating. Notable also is the bezel, which is as simple as they get, bidirectional and friction controlled. It's fairly easy to grip, and the glossy index at 12 sunk deeply into the metal is very legible. Of course, for some this will just be too simple to be practical, and I can appreciate that. Even so, it's hard to beat the one-glance utility of the contrast provided. The only criticism I can level at the bezel is that it absolutely requires 2 fingers to turn. Inside the watch's case is a bold but simple choice of movement, the Sellita SW510, essentially a Veligil 7750 with no automatic winding and a horizontal dial orientation, but retaining hacking and a 4Hz beat rate. The choice is, it's only fair to say, an emotional and, I reckon, good one, because not only does this mitigate the good old 7750's thickness problem, the 417ES is only 11.55mm thick to the top of the bezel and 13.3 to the top of the crystal, but also allows one of the periodic joys of winding it up, albeit not too periodic a joy, with a power reserve extended somewhat beyond the 48 hours normally seen to 58 hours. Note, however, that the autonomy is roughly halved by constant chronograph use. Allowing the stopwatch to be used, 2 symmetrical pushers replace the larger asymmetrical ones normally seen from Hanhart in the Pioneer range, and give a somewhat less eccentric demeanour. More interesting is the crown, which, as per the 1950s versus 1930s design, is smaller, flatter and sharper to not lose any practicality. On its top is a vintage Hanhart H. For reasonable comparison, putting this 7750 next to that of my Aquastar Deepstar, the engagement is, it must be said, a tad more brutal, with a cam rather than column wheel actuation, yet the chronograph remains extremely crisp and anything but inaccurate. The Deepstar is, after all, twice the price. In summary, there are only 2 potential negatives to this movement. The first is that it isn't particularly lavishly decorated, a moot point given that you won't see it under the closed caseback, but the second one is that whilst the original watch featured a flyback function, this watch doesn't, although in view of the necessity for a third party to make this complication bespoke, I would expect at least £1,000 price increase. And to my mind, it may somewhat mar the image of a tough traditional pilot's chronograph for the German Air Force if it were to be priced as a luxury competing with, let's say, Tudor. But now, under a thick vintage-style domed sapphire crystal, we have to address the dial. Bizarrely, given that most aviation Hanharts refer to older models than the 417, it's this watch which features the most original dial. The surface is a rich black which, whilst finely grained, feels inherently old-fashioned by paling to grey in some lighting. This particular style of understatement is echoed by a concentric pattern on the sunken subdials, only really visible under magnification, but which seems to help them stand out. Having such a strong vintage military emphasis, this was always going to be a dial in need of high-quality print, given the lack of any applied dial elements. Generally, the quality is flawless, even if you have to look harder to enjoy it than with the applied numerals of, say, a Longines Spirit. If you trace the path of the second track or the original style logo, you do get a sense of what the 1950s model was all about, with a slightly raised and very glossy surface to catch the eye. Of course, there are a few different fonts across the dial, but selected according to placement, I doubt that this detracts from the delightful details like the open sixes. Finally, you have the Arabic numerals, which are formed of a white, printed outline and a slightly off-colour and extremely tall mound of C3GL superluminova. These may curiously be my favourite details of the watch, with a 6 and 4 which are particularly beautiful. Where legibility is concerned, these are paired with similarly luminous pencil hands which, by being simpler than earlier cathedral hands, do make for easier use. These are very cleanly painted white, although perhaps without the refinement of, let's say, an Omega Speedmaster. The pièce de résistance, without question, is the Leaf second hand, with a skeletonized counterweight. Whilst not giving nighttime legibility to the very edge of the dial, this arrangement actually makes the watch much easier to read under such circumstances, glows for longer, and does make me wonder why it isn't seen more often. The luminosity in the dark is, and I'm starting to tire of using such extreme terms in reference to this timepiece, pretty fantastic and rivals dive watches I own on account of the large dial and thick luminous application. Maybe this shouldn't be surprising, but it makes for extremely helpful use when you put the watch down on your bedside table. Finally, I'd like to touch on the packaging and the strap. The strap is a bund strap with a removable central section and is produced from very supple but quite simple black leather. It's not necessarily an eye-catcher, but seems more in spirit of the watch than anything else. The only word of warning is that the bund section may be an annoyance to those with smaller wrists, whilst the lug width of 21mm will either allow you to wear both 20mm and 22mm straps, or depending upon the person, will stop either from being used. It is after all a personal choice. What is universal is just how good the packaging is. Offered in a black, presumably leatherette roll lined with Alcantara like the strap, the watch can be fastened in place with a light, travel-friendly and very premium feel, which might just be the best answer at the moment to the ever-raging question of useful watch packaging. The Hanhart 417 ES is a funny watch really. It isn't the most versatile watch in the world, it isn't the most complex, however it's also a watch which really brings a smile to the face. The chronograph is simple but its operation is a delight, and the bezel is just useful enough to be convenient. This is also not a watch to wear its vintage style too close to the surface, but rather uses it as an excuse to slow down and simplify the format. Of course, if you were thinking purely technically, a Sinn 103 in its endless variants and iterations would provide more in the way of complications and a design which was at the start of a new era in the 1960s, rather than the end of another in the 1950s. But really, if you like this Hanhart, I'm not sure much else will do. But what do you think of this watch? Is it a success, or does it lose something by being simpler than other watches? Let me know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, share and subscribe to make sure that they keep coming. Thank you very much for watching. This is Armon from WatchChronicler.com. Out.